The wind tearing through the high passes of the Wind River Range did not sound like air moving over stone. It sounded like a dying animal, a low guttural shriek that vibrated through the marrow of the bone. It was the winter of 1882, a season that the old-timers in the Bighorn Basin would speak of in hushed, reverent tones for decades to come. It was the kind of cold that froze the sap inside the mighty blue spruce trees until their trunks exploded with a sound like cannon fire in the dead of night. At 10,000 feet above the sprawling, lawless valleys of the Wyoming Territory, the world was nothing but a swirling, chaotic void of white. Up here, survival was not a matter of luck. It was a matter of brutal, calculated endurance. Nathaniel Reed sat in a hand-carved rocking chair before a roaring stone hearth. He was a man who looked as though he had been chipped from the very granite of the mountains he inhabited. His face was a map of hard miles and harder choices weathers by decades of sun, wind, and violence. A thick graying beard obscured the lower half of his face, but it could not hide the jagged, pale scar that ran from his left cheekbone down to his jaw, a souvenir from a Comanche lance, long before he had abandoned the army, abandoned the uniform, and abandoned the company of men entirely. He was a mountain man by trade, a trapper, and a solitary hunter. But those titles were merely a cover for his true occupation, exile. He had seen too much of the world's cruelty during his years as a scout for General Crook. He had watched treaties broken before the ink was dry, and he had seen the greed of cattle barons turn lush valleys into graveyards. So Nathaniel had climbed until the air grew thin and the snows grew deep, building a fortress of thick, interlocking pine logs where the corruption of the flatlands could not reach him. The cabin was small, but immensely sturdy, chinked with mud and horsehair to keep the biting drafts at bay. The interior smelled of smoked venison, oiled saddle leather, and the sharp, caustic tang of the lye soap he rendered himself. The fire in the hearth was the only source of light, casting long, dancing shadows across the log walls adorned with steel traps and stretched pelts. Outside, the blizzard slammed against the timber with the force of a physical blow. The roof beams, thick as a man's torso, groaned in agonizing protest. Nathaniel did not flinch. He sat rhythmically, running an oiled cloth over the long, octagonal barrel of his .5 0-90 Sharps buffalo rifle. The mechanical snick-snack of the massive hammer being cocked and gently lowered was the only sound inside the cabin, a metallic metronome keeping time against the storm. He liked the weight of the rifle. It was honest. It only did exactly what a man told it to do. He reached for a tin cup of black bitter coffee resting on a stone near the flames. As his calloused fingers brushed the warm metal, a sound cut through the howling gale. It was faint at first, easily mistaken for a broken branch striking the heavy oak door. But it came again. 3 distinct rhythmic thuds. Thud, thud, thud. Nathaniel froze. The oiled cloth slipped from his fingers, landing softly on the woven rug beneath his boots. He did not breathe. He calculated the impossibility of the sound. The nearest settlement was 40 miles down the mountain. The snowdrifts outside were 6 feet deep and rising. A man on horseback wouldn't make it a mile in this whiteout. A man on foot would be dead in an hour. No living soul should be at 10,000 feet in the middle of the worst blizzard of the decade. Thud, 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 thud. This time the knocking was frantic, desperate. It was the sound of someone whose strength was failing, someone beating their frozen fists against the wood as a final dying plea. Nathaniel stood slowly. His joints popped in the quiet cabin. He picked up the sharps, his thumb naturally finding the heavy hammer. He expected a starved mountain lion drawn by the smell of meat, or perhaps a delirious, frostbitten prospector who had lost his mind in his way. He stepped cautiously toward the door, his boots making no sound on the floorboards. He slid the heavy iron crossbar to the side. It protested with a loud scrape. He gripped the iron latch, took a slow, steadying breath of the wood smoke-scented air, and pulled the heavy door inward. The gale ripped into the cabin the moment the latch gave way, a roaring, icy monster that instantly sucked the warmth from the room and sent the flames in the hearth thrashing wildly. A flurry of blinding white snow swirled across the threshold, stinging Nathaniel's face like thrown sand. Framed in the doorway against the terrifying blackness of the mountain night stood 3 figures. Nathaniel tightened his grip on the rifle, his blue eyes narrowing against the wind. The lantern light spilled out over them, revealing not a lost prospector or a desperate outlaw, but an Apache woman and two young girls. They were covered head to toe in a thick crust of snow and ice. The oldest woman stood in the center, her posture unnaturally rigid, forced upright by sheer agonizing willpower. Her face was a landscape of profound exhaustion, her skin pulled taut over her cheekbones, carrying the pale grayish pallor that precedes deep frostbite. She had wrapped a single threadbare woolen blanket around herself, but she was using the bulk of her own freezing body to shield the two smaller figures pressed frantically against her sides. To her left stood a girl on the cusp of womanhood, perhaps 17. Even trembling violently, her jaw clamped shut to keep her teeth from chattering. Her eyes were wide alert and fiercely defensive. She glared at Nathaniel at the massive rifle in his hands with the dark polished intensity of obsidian. For 3 agonizing seconds, no one moved. The wind screamed through the open doorway. The unwritten law of the high frontier screamed just as loudly in Nathaniel's mind. Mind your own business to stay alive. To harbor runaways, especially Apache, in a territory aggressively hostile to their very existence, was an invitation to a hanging. "No one will take us in," the mother said. Her voice was barely a whisper shredded by the cold and the wind, yet her English was precise, carrying the clipped, formal cadence of someone who had learned the language in the rigid confines of a reservation fort. "They shut their doors in the valley?" She rasped, her eyes locking onto Nathaniel's scarred face. She did not beg. She merely stated the brutal facts of their reality. "They say we bring death. Please." Nathaniel looked at the 12-year-old girl. The spasms racking her small frame were slowing down, a dangerous sign. The cold was putting her to sleep, a sleep from which she would never wake. The hardened shell Nathaniel had spent 20 years building around his soul cracked. The frontier was cruel, but he was not. He stepped back, lowering the heavy barrel of the buffalo rifle until the muzzle rested against the floorboards. With his free hand, he gestured sharply inward. "Get inside." Nathaniel barked, his voice gruff, loud enough to cut through the shrieking wind. "Quickly, before the wind takes the roof." The woman did not hesitate. She ushered her daughters forward, dragging their numb, unresponsive feet over the wooden threshold. As soon as they were clear, Nathaniel threw his shoulder against the heavy oak door, fighting the incredible pressure of the gale to push it shut. He dropped the iron crossbar back into its brackets with a heavy, definitive clang that echoed through the small space. The sudden cessation of the wind was deafening. Inside the cabin, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the ragged, wet gasping of the 3 women. Nathaniel moved with the sudden practiced efficiency of a man who had survived 100 winter campaigns. He leaned the sharps against the wall and walked to the heavy cedar chest at the foot of his cot. He pulled out 3 massive, brain-tanned buffalo robes, the thickest, warmest furs he possessed. "Sit. As close to the hearth as you can stand without burning yourselves," he commanded, pointing yet a calloused finger toward the stones. The mother guided her daughters to the rug. Their movements were jerky, uncoordinated. Nathaniel tossed the heavy robes over them. The teenage girl, the one with the obsidian eyes, flinched slightly as the heavy fur landed over her shoulders, her hand instinctively moving toward the folds of her wet tunic as if reaching for a hidden blade. Nathaniel noticed the movement, but ignored it. A girl with survival instincts was a girl who might live to see the spring. He grabbed a heavy iron kettle sitting on the edge of the hearth and swung it directly over the hottest coals. He took 3 tin bowls from a shelf and ladled out thick, steaming portions of the venison stew he had been simmering all day. He knelt before them, handing the first bowl to the mother. "Eat the broth first, slowly. If you eat the meat too fast, your stomachs will reject it." The mother took the bowl with trembling hands. "I am Gwen," she whispered, the warmth of the steam rising into her frozen face. She nodded to the fierce-eyed teenager. "This is Detest, and my youngest, Taba." Nathaniel did not offer his name in return. He handed a bowl to Detest, who took it without breaking eye contact, and then carefully held the last bowl up for the youngest Taba. The child's hands were shaking too violently to hold the tin. Without a word, Nathaniel knelt on the rug. His massive, scarred hands, capable of breaking a man's neck or snapping a bear trap, gently cupped the hot tin bowl and guided it to the child's cracked lips. "Sip," he instructed softly, the gruffness entirely gone from his voice. "Just sip, little one." For the next hour, no one spoke. Nathaniel returned to his rocking chair and the shadows retreating into his silence.
He watched them from beneath furrowed, graying brows as the heat of the fire and the rich, fatty broth began to work their slow miracle. The violent shivering subsided into gentle tremors. The pale gray of their skin slowly yielded to a flushed, bruised red as blood painfully returned to their extremities.
The mountain outside continued to rage, completely oblivious to the small pocket of mercy hidden within its crags. Nathaniel watched the firelight dance across Gwen's weathered, dignified face. The Apache did not wander up into the Wind River snowdrifts by accident. They did not climb to 10,000 feet in a whiteout unless whatever was chasing them was significantly more terrifying than freezing to death. He picked up the oiled cloth and resumed wiping down his rifle. "You're a long way from the Southern Territories, Gwen," Nathaniel said quietly, his voice a low rumble in the warm cabin. "What hunts you?" Gwen lowered her empty tin bowl to the stone hearth. The physical act of eating seemed to have restored a measure of the regal strength that the mountain had tried to strip away from her. She pulled the buffalo robe tighter around her shoulders, the thick fur framing her face, and looked across the small room at the solitary man in the shadows. "We are running from a man worse than the devil, sir," Gwen said, her voice steady, now devoid of the earlier desperation. "Amos Caldwell." Nathaniel's hand stopped moving along the barrel of the rifle. The rhythmic wiping ceased. The name seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the room. Amos Caldwell was not a myth whispered around campfires. He was a brutal flesh and blood reality. He was the wealthiest cattle baron in the Bighorn Basin. He was a man who owned the land as far as the eye could see, and what he did not own legally, he controlled through violence. Caldwell owned the territorial judges, bought the sheriffs, and maintained his massive empire with a private army of ruthless enforcers, men who had traded their badges for Caldwell's gold and left their consciences to rot in the desert. If Caldwell wanted a man ruined, he was bankrupt by morning. If Caldwell wanted a man dead, he was buried before sundown.
"Dave Caldwell," Nathaniel repeated. The word tasted foul in his mouth. Men don't cross Amos Caldwell and live long enough to reach the snow line. What could an Apache woman and two girls possibly do to draw the eye of the biggest baron in the territory? Why, they say we stole his horses, Gwen replied, her dark eyes reflecting the orange glow of the embers. They say we crept into the basin in the dead of night and set fire to his northern grain silos. He has put a bounty on our heads, $500 for me, 300 for my daughters, dead or alive. His men prefer dead. It is less trouble to transport a corpse over the mountains. Nathaniel's eyes flicked to the heavy leather satchel resting near Deteste's feet. "Did you?" he asked. His tone was perfectly flat, carrying neither judgment nor accusation. He just needed to know exactly what kind of war he had just let through his front door.
It was Deteste who answered. The teenage girl threw off the heavy folds of the buffalo robe and sat up straight. The exhaustion in her face was entirely eclipsed by a sudden fierce anger.
"No." Deteste spat the word cracking like a whip in the quiet room. "We stole nothing from that butcher. We burned nothing. We are hunted not for what we took, but for what we saw."
She reached down and grabbed the leather satchel. Her fingers, still clumsy from the cold, fumbled briefly with the thick iron buckle before pulling the flap open. She reached inside and pulled out a tightly bound heavy leather ledger. She slammed it onto the scarred wooden dining table. Then she reached into her pocket and placed a second object right on top of the book.
It was a silver badge, a six-pointed star heavily tarnished and smeared with a thick crust of dried blackened blood.
Nathaniel slowly stood up from his rocking chair. He walked over to the table, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He didn't touch the items. He just stared at the federal stamp etched into the blood-caked silver.
3 weeks ago, Gwen continued, her voice dropping to a somber, mournful register. Dates and I were gathering healing herbs near the borders of the reservation. The rations had not arrived for months. Our people were starving. While we searched the dry gullies, we heard gunshots, heavy rifles. We hid in the brush and waited until the riders left.
Gwen closed her eyes, the memory clearly painful. When we crept down into the wash, we found a white man dying in the dirt. He had been shot twice in the back. He was coughing up blood, but he was holding on to life just long enough to pass his burden. He told us his name was Thomas Mitchell. He was an agent for the federal government in Washington. Nathaniel knew the name. The rumors had drifted up even to his isolated peaks. Washington had sent an investigator to look into the massive discrepancies in the Indian agency's ledgers.
Mitchell died in my arms, Gwen said. But before he passed, he shoved that ledger and his badge into my hands. The book, it is everything. It holds the records, the dates, the shipping manifests. It proves that Amos Caldwell has been intercepting the government beef rations meant for the tribes. He has been starving our people, rebranding the cattle, and selling them to the army forts at double the profit. He is paying the local Indian agents to look the other way.
Datesy pointed a sharp finger at the book. Caldwell's men tracked Mitchell. They killed him to bury the truth, but they saw us fleeing the gully. Caldwell knows we have the book. He framed us for the fire and the horses so he could send his bounty hunters after us legally. If he gets that ledger back, the truth dies with us in the snow. Nathaniel stared at the blood-stained metal. The silence in the cabin was heavy, suffocating. He had spent his entire adult life running away from this exact type of civilized bloodshed. He had retreated higher and higher into the timber-building walls of wood and stone to keep the greed of men at bay. He had sworn to the mountain that he would never again raise a rifle for another man's war. But as he looked at the frightened, exhausted faces of the women huddled by his fire, and at the undeniable proof of a murdered lawman resting on his table, Nathaniel realized a cold, hard truth. The world had finally climbed the mountain. There was no higher ground left to retreat to. He reached out and picked up the heavy ledger, feeling the coarse leather beneath his thumb. He looked toward the thick oak door, listening to the shrieking wind outside. The storm was the only thing keeping them alive tonight.
Get some sleep, Nathaniel ordered, turning away from the table and walking back to his rocking chair. He didn't lay down. He didn't close his eyes. He sat down, laid the heavy Sharps rifle across his knees, and stared blindly into the dying embers.
Tomorrow, he whispered into the dark, we figure out how to keep you alive. The night stretched out long and agonizingly slow, measured only by the steady rhythmic breathing of the three women sleeping on the floorboards and the violent howling of the wind outside. Nathaniel Reed did not sleep. He had learned decades ago in the blood-soaked canyons of the southern plains that sleep was a luxury a hunted man could ill afford. He remained in his rocking chair, entirely motionless, a ghost in his own home. The fire had burned down to a mound of glowing ruby-red embers, casting just enough light to illuminate the silver star resting on the heavy oak table. Nathaniel couldn't take his eyes off it, the badge of Agent Thomas Mitchell. He leaned forward, the old leather of his chair groaning softly, and picked up the piece of metal. It was heavy in his calloused palm. The blackened, dried blood flaked slightly against his thumb. He had worn a badge once a long time ago, a cavalry scout's insignia. He remembered the weight of it, the foolish pride he had felt when he first pinned it to his wool tunic, believing he was bringing order to a wild, untamed world.
He had been a fool. The order the politicians in Washington spoke of was nothing but a polite word for slaughter. He had watched the army he served burn winter camps, destroy food stores, and slaughter horses, leaving women and children to freeze in the snow, all to clear the land for the very cattle barons who now ruled the Bighorn Basin. He had thrown his insignia into a muddy river in the Dakotas and walked away into the timber, vowing never to be a part of the civilized world's machinery of death again.
He looked down at the floor. Gwen had pulled the heavy buffalo robe over little Taba, completely shielding the child from the creeping cold of the cabin. Datest, even in the depths of exhaustion, slept with her hand resting lightly over the leather satchel that held the ledger. They had been victims of the same machine Nathaniel had once served, yet they had not broken. They had found a dying white man in the dirt, a man who represented the government that oppressed them, and instead of leaving him to the buzzards, they had comforted him. They had taken his burden.
We stole nothing, Datest had said. We saw something.
Nathaniel closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the wood. The mountain had demanded a high price for his solitude. It had demanded isolation, a freezing of his own humanity. But as the wind outside finally began to lose its terrifying shrieking pitch, dropping to a low, mournful moan, Nathaniel realized that a man could only run for so long before he ran out of mountain. He slipped the blood-stained badge into the deep pocket of his heavy canvas coat. Then he stood up and walked silently to the locked wooden cabinet in the corner of the room. He reached to a leather thong around his neck and pulled a heavy iron key from beneath his shirt. The cabinet door swung open with a quiet squeak of oiled hinges. Inside was the arsenal of a man who never intended to be a victim again. He bypassed the hunting rifles and reached for the heavy iron. He pulled out a pair of twin Colt single-action army revolvers, their blued steel gleaming dully in the low light. He checked the cylinders, loading a fresh .45 caliber cartridge into the empty chamber he usually kept under the hammer for safety. There would be no need for safety today. He slid them into the worn, oiled leather holsters of his gun belt and buckled it around his waist. Next, he pulled out a Winchester model, 1873 lever action rifle. He loaded a handful of .44-40 cartridges into the side gate, the brass gleaming like gold in the shadows. He set the Winchester gently on the table next to D'Artest. By the time he finished, the cabin was freezing. The air inside had grown so cold that his breath plumed in faint white clouds. He walked to the single thick glass window. The frost had crept up the pane in intricate fern-like patterns. He rubbed a small circle clear with his thumb and peered out.
The storm had broken.
The sky in the east was bruising purple, bleeding into a cold, fragile gray. The snow had stopped falling entirely. The blizzard had left behind a terrifyingly beautiful world, buried under 3 feet of pristine, untouched white powder. The towering pines looked like hunched, frozen sentinels.
It was a beautiful morning, and it was a death sentence.
In the mountains, a sudden lull after a blizzard meant only one thing: clear tracks. Any sign they had left at the base of the mountain would be buried. But the moment the sun crested the peaks, Caldwell's trackers would begin cutting sign along the lower ridges looking for broken branches, disturbed snow, or the faint scent of wood smoke on the downdraft. Nathaniel walked to the hearth and tossed 3 thick splits of dried cedar onto the embers. The wood caught almost instantly with a loud crackle, sending a rush of warmth back into the room. He grabbed the tin percolator, filled it from a bucket of melted snow, and dumped a generous handful of bitter black coffee grounds into the basket.
The smell of the roasting coffee was sharp and sudden. It roused D'Artest first. The teenage girl sat up, the buffalo robe falling from her shoulders. Her hand immediately darted to the Winchester rifle resting beside her on the table. She looked at Nathaniel, her dark eyes wide with sudden alarm.
"The wind stopped," D'Artest whispered, realizing the implication immediately. "It did," Nathaniel replied, setting the percolator on the hot stones. He turned to face her, his scarred face set in stone. "Wake your mother, drink the coffee. We don't have much time." Dawn broke over the Wind River range with a brilliant, blinding clarity. The sun crested the jagged peaks, striking the fresh snow and turning the entire world into a sea of crushed diamonds. The air was so brutally cold that it burned the lungs with every breath, yet the sky was an innocent, cloudless blue. Inside the cabin, the tension was a physical weight. Gwen sat by the hearth, her arm wrapped protectively around young Taba, who was staring wide-eyed at the heavy guns Nathaniel had laid out. D'Artest stood near the window, the Winchester rifle held perfectly at the ready, her thumb resting instinctively on the hammer. Nathaniel stood on his small, snow-covered porch. He had stepped outside, leaving the heavy oak door open just a crack, holding a steaming tin cup of coffee. He wasn't drinking it. He was watching the tree line 200 yards down the slope.
The absolute silence of the mountain morning was unnerving. There was no wind, there was no rustle of pine needles.
Then Nathaniel heard it. The blue jays in the lower thicket of blue spruce suddenly took flight, a flurry of azure wings darting away into the deeper timber, scolding angrily as they fled. A moment later, a faint, rhythmic crunching sound drifted up the slope, the sound of heavy horses struggling through deep powder. They were here. Nathaniel stepped backward over the threshold, pulling the heavy door shut with him. He dropped the iron crossbar into place. He didn't rush. He moved with the terrifying, deliberate calm of a man walking to the gallows.
"Get the little one to the root cellar," Nathaniel ordered, pointing to a heavy woven rug in the center of the room. "Now!"
Gwen moved swiftly. She threw the rug aside, grabbed the iron ring set into the floorboards, and heaved upward. The trapdoor swung open, revealing a dark, earthen cellar, smelling of damp soil and preserved peaches. She practically shoved Taba down the wooden ladder, whispering a rapid, fierce string of Apache to the terrified child, before dropping the heavy wooden door back into place.
"They're close," D'Artest asked, racking the lever of the Winchester. A brass cartridge chunked into the chamber with a loud mechanical clatter.
"They're at the edge of the clearing," Nathaniel said. He picked up his massive Sharps buffalo rifle and slid a narrow horizontal wooden slat set into the center of the oak door, a firing port he had carved years ago for exactly this kind of morning. He peered through the slit. 4 men sat on massive, steam-breathing horses at the edge of the timber. They looked like ragged, violent stains against the perfect white snow. The horses were lathered in frozen sweat, their chests heaving from the brutal climb. In the lead sat Cole Harrison. He wore a heavy coat, made of patched wolf skin, a bowler hat pulled low over his eyes, and a thick woolen scarf wrapped around his lower face. A Winchester repeating rifle rested lazily across his saddle pommel. Harrison was a former Texas Ranger who had discovered that killing men for bounties paid significantly better than arresting them for the state. He was a man who enjoyed the cruelty of his work, a man who smiled when the blood flowed. Flanking him were 3 hired guns, rough men pulled from the saloons of the Basin. Pike, a massive brute with a face ruined by smallpox scars. O'Bannon, a nervous-looking man nursing a shotgun. And Jessup. Jessup was the real danger. He was a wiry, rat-faced man wearing a filthy canvas coat, currently leaning over his saddle to inspect the snow. He was Caldwell's chief tracker, a man reputed to be able to track a ghost across solid rock. Jessup pointed a gloved finger directly at the cabin, then tapped his own nose. He smelled the wood smoke. Hello, the cabin, Harrison bellowed. His voice was harsh and grating, carrying easily across the snowy expanse. We know you're in there, Reed. Come to the door. Bard spot. Nathaniel did not move. He kept his eye pressed to the slit, his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard of the sharps. State your business, Harrison, Nathaniel yelled back, his deep voice echoing off the surrounding peaks. You're trespassing on my claim. Harrison chuckled, a dry, rattling sound that carried on the cold air. He spurred his horse a few steps closer to the cabin, stopping just out of easy revolver range. Morning, Nathaniel. I didn't expect to find an old hermit like you playing host this far up the rock. Harrison called out, his tone dripping with false cordiality. We're tracking 3 runaway squaws. Stole a fair bit of property from Mr. Caldwell down in the Basin. Burned a silo, too. We tracked them right to the base of this ridge before the snow covered the tracks. You seen them? Haven't seen a soul in 3 weeks. Nathaniel lied effortlessly, his voice flat and unyielding. Just me and the pines up here. You boys turn your horses around before they freeze to the ground. The trail is cold. Harrison's smile vanished beneath his scarf. His cold, dead eyes narrowed. He looked at Jessup, who shook his head emphatically. No. Now, Nathaniel, don't take me for a fool. Harrison said, his voice losing all its feigned warmth, dropping into a dangerous snarl. Jessup here says he smells fresh wood smoke, and he found a scrap of wet wool snagged on a bramble down the slope. Now I know you make your own clothes out of buckskin. You ain't wearing wool, and you sure as hell don't drink enough coffee to need a fire this hot. Harrison drew his Winchester from the saddle, resting the butt on his thigh. Hand them over, Reed. There's a hefty bounty on their heads. Mr. Caldwell is a generous man. He's willing to split the money with you for your cooperation. You give us the Indians and the ledger they stole, and we ride away. You go back to playing Mountain Man. Inside the cabin, Deteste stepped closer to the door, her breathing shallow and fast. She looked at Nathaniel, waiting to see if the gold of the cattle baron would break the old man's resolve. Nathaniel slid the massive octagonal barrel of the Sharp's rifle slowly through the firing slit. The dark steel glinted in the morning sun. I told you there's no one here, Nathaniel warned, his voice a terrifyingly calm rumble. Take one more step toward this porch, Harrison, and I'll put a .50 caliber slug clean through your chest. It'll leave a hole big enough for a barn owl to fly through. The threat hung in the frigid air, heavy and absolute. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the heavy, rhythmic snorting of the bounty hunters' lathered horses. The hired guns, Pike O'Bannon and Jessup, instinctively tightened their grips on their rifles. The mechanical clacking of hammers being cocked cut sharply through the quiet mountain air, a deadly chorus of steel and spring. Harrison did not back down. Instead, his face flushed, a dark, violent red beneath his woolen scarf. He had spent his entire life bullying the weak and intimidating the fearful. Being defied by an old hermit and a wooden door was an insult his fragile, cruel ego could not tolerate. You're making a mistake, old man, Harrison spat, swinging down from his saddle and using the massive bulk of his horse as temporary cover. You're a relic of ghost. You can't hold off 4 of us, not for some thieving Indians. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was suffocating. The heat of the fire clashed with the icy drafts seeping through the firing slit. Detesta moved with a sudden fluid grace. She stepped up to the window, keeping her body pressed flat against the thick log wall, and leveled the barrel of her Winchester through the frost-covered glass. She closed her left eye, her breathing slowing down to a preternatural calm. "Detest," Nathaniel said, his voice devoid of all emotion, a terrifying serenity settling over his features. "Take the window. If any man steps out from behind cover and raises a rifle, you put him in the snow." Dedes nodded once her jaw set. "I will." Outside, Harrison was shouting orders. "Pike, get behind that felled pine on the left. O'Bannon, take the boulder on the right. We pin him down, then we burn him out, whatever soon." The men scrambled through the deep snow. Pike, the massive brute, lunged toward a thick, snow-covered pine log about 50 yards from the porch. O'Bannon scurried toward a granite outcropping. Jessup, the wiry tracker, simply vanished into a thicket of blue spruce, melting into the shadows like a wraith. Nathaniel tracked Pike's movement through the narrow slit. He didn't need to hit the man directly. At this range, the heavy Sharps rifle wasn't just a gun, it was a cannon. He thumbed back the massive hammer. The metallic click was deafening in the small cabin. "Last chance, Reed," Harrison bellowed from behind a snowbank. "Send the squaws out with—"
The time for talking was over.
A rifle cracked from the spruce thicket. Jessup had fired the first shot. The bullet crossed the clearing in a fraction of a second and shattered the thick glass of the cabin window. The pane exploded inward in a shower of deadly jagged shards. One piece sliced across Detest's cheek, drawing a thin, bright line of crimson, but the Apache girl did not flinch. She barely even blinked. She tracked the muzzle flash in the thicket, exhaled a slow breath of condensing air, and squeezed the trigger of her Winchester twice in rapid succession.
Crack, crack.
A heavy thud sounded from the brush, followed by a string of vile, high-pitched curses. "She clipped me," Jessup yelled, his voice echoing off the rocky crags, thick with panic. "The squaw's got a repeating rifle, but—" Nathaniel didn't wait for Harrison's men to recover their nerve. He took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs, and aimed the heavy buffalo rifle at the center of the felled pine log where Pike was hiding. He settled the front sight perfectly, whispered, a quiet plea to a god he hadn't spoken to in 20 years, and squeezed the trigger. The roar of the Sharps .50-90 was apocalyptic. It wasn't a crack or a bang. It was a booming thunderclap that physically shook the cabin. Dust and dried mud rained down from the rafters. The recoil punched into Nathaniel's shoulder like the kick of a mule, but his eyes never left the firing slit. The massive half-ounce lead slug crossed the clearing and slammed into the dead pine log with devastating force. The wood did not stop the bullet. It merely gave it more teeth. The log exploded outward. A jagged chunk of timber, propelled with the force of military shrapnel, struck Pike square in the shoulder. The hired gun screamed a horrific bubbling sound, dropping his rifle into the snowbank as he tumbled backward, clutching a mangled, bloody arm. "Return fire!" Harrison bellowed, his voice cracking with sudden, unbridled panic. "Riddle the place, tear it to the ground." The tree line erupted in a chaotic strobe, light of muzzle flashes. Heavy lead slugs chewed into the thick oak door, thudding into the timber with sickening force. Splinters flew through the cabin like deadly wooden hail. "Keep your heads down!" Nathaniel roared over the deafening mechanical clatter of lever-action rifles. He dropped to one knee, smoothly dropping the breech block of the Sharps. Thick, sulphurous white smoke poured from the chamber. He pulled a fresh, massive brass cartridge from his belt, shoved it home, and snapped the action shut. The cabin was rapidly filling with the acrid, burning stench of black powder. The battle devolved into a deafening, terrifying rhythm of violence. The hired guns poured a continuous stream of lead into the cabin, trying to suppress the deadly accuracy of the defenders. Every few seconds, Detest would pop up her face, smeared with soot and a thin trickle of blood fire. 2 rapid shots from her Winchester and ducked back down as bullets shattered the timber around her. Nathaniel moved from the firing slit to a narrow chink between the logs near the hearth. He fired the Sharps again, the thunderous boom echoing across the valley. A branch above O'Bannon's head snapped off, burying the nervous gunman under a cascade of heavy snow. Behind the snow-covered pine, Harrison dragged the moaning, bleeding Pike by his collar. The bounty hunter's face was twisted in a manic rage. This was supposed to be a simple execution. It was supposed to be a quick massacre of 3 unarmed women. Instead, he found himself in a full-blown siege against a fortified mountain man who shot like an army sniper, and an Apache girl who was systematically dismantling his crew. O'Bannon, huddled behind the granite boulder, had stopped firing. His hands were shaking so violently he dropped his next shotgun shell into the snow. He looked at the blood pooling under Pike and then back at the heavily fortified cabin. The old stories of Nathaniel Reed were bleeding back into his mind. Stories of a cavalry scout who had survived the worst massacres of the Indian Wars by being more ruthless than the men hunting him. "Harrison, this is madness," O'Bannon shouted over the whistling wind and the sporadic gunfire. "You said they were just runaways. That old man is Nathaniel Reed, and they're shooting like they're defending Fort Laramie. If they've got federal papers in there, we're dancing with the hangman." Harrison turned his cold, dead eyes toward his own man. The bounty hunter had long ago crossed the line between the law and outright butchery. Caldwell paid him not just to kill, but to leave no loose ends. And right now, O'Bannon was rapidly becoming a frayed thread. "I said suppress the cabin, O'Bannon," Harrison hissed, drawing his heavy Colt revolver from his hip. "Keep your gun up and fire." "Bull, I ain't dying for Caldwell's stolen beef," O'Bannon yelled, his voice cracking with terror. He threw his shotgun into the snow. He stood up from behind the boulder, raising his empty hands high in the air, preparing to shout a surrender to Nathaniel. "Reed, we quit, I'm throwing down." The twist of Harrison's cruelty was absolute. He didn't hesitate. He didn't even blink. He raised the Colt revolver, aimed down the sights, and shot his own man squarely in the center of the back. The loud crack of the pistol shot cut through the chaos. O'Bannon stiffened, a look of profound shock crossing his face before he slumped forward face first into the deep snowdrift. The pristine white powder around him rapidly turned a dark, sickening crimson. Inside the cabin, Nathaniel watched the betrayal through the chink in the logs. His blood ran cold. He had seen terrible things in war, but the casual murder of a comrade spoke of a darkness that could not be reasoned with. "He just killed his own man," Nathaniel muttered, his voice tight. Detace paused, reloading her Winchester. "Why?" "Because he isn't leaving here without that ledger," Nathaniel replied grimly. "Even if he has to burn the mountain down to get it." As if on cue, Harrison holstered his revolver and crawled back to his horse. He pulled a thick canvas-wrapped bundle from his saddlebags. It was a bundle of mining dynamite, 4 heavy sticks lashed tightly together around a pitch-soaked rag. He pulled a sulfur match from his coat pocket and struck it against his boot heel. The flame flared bright yellow in the cold air. Harrison touched the match to the rag. It hissed instantly, a sputtering trail of angry sparks dancing along the fuse. With a desperate looping throw, Harrison hurled the explosive bundle over the barricade, aiming directly for the cabin's sloping roof. "Fire in the hole!" Harrison screamed, diving face first into the snow. Through the narrow slit, Nathaniel saw the sparking arc of the dynamite. His heart hammered against his ribs. "Fire!" Gwen screamed from the floorboards. She had been guarding the heavy rug over the root cellar. Seconds later, the dynamite detonated.
The blast was catastrophic. It shook the very bedrock beneath the cabin. A massive hole was blown clean through the thick cedar shingles and the heavy roof beams. The concussive shockwave blew the front door entirely off its iron hinges, sending the heavy oak crashing onto the floor. Burning debris, splinters, and flaming cedar rained down upon the wooden floorboards.
Instantly, the dry, bare rugs, the oiled leather of the saddles, and the spilled kerosene from a shattered lantern ignited. A wall of roaring orange flame erupted in the center of the room. Thick, oily black smoke began to billow through the one-room cabin, choking the air, blinding them, and sucking the oxygen from their lungs.
The heat was instantaneous and absolute, a physical wall that slammed into them with the force of a runaway train. The explosion had shattered the structural integrity of the cabin, and the roof was caving in, raining burning cedar shingles and glowing embers down upon them. Thick, oily black smoke, the toxic byproduct of burning pitch, oiled leather, and gunpowder immediately banked against the ceiling and began rolling down toward the floorboards, seeking to drown them in darkness.
The cellar. Nathaniel roared over the deafening crackle of the flames. He didn't bother trying to extinguish the fire. It was a lost cause. The mountain had reclaimed his sanctuary in a matter of seconds. Gwen was already there, kneeling beside the open trap door. She was coughing violently, her eyes streaming with tears, but her grip on the iron ring was unyielding. Datesh stood her ground near the ruined window for 3 more seconds, firing the Winchester blindly into the smoke-filled clearing to keep Harrison and his men pinned down before her rifle clicked empty.
I'm out, Dates yelled, throwing the useless Winchester to the floor.
Wuthao, go down, Nathaniel ordered, grabbing her by the shoulder of her tunic and practically throwing her toward the dark gaping hole in the floorboards. Datesig scrambled down the wooden ladder, vanishing into the gloom where little Taba was already weeping softly. Gwen followed her movements, desperate but surprisingly agile for a woman who had been freezing to death only hours earlier. Nathaniel was the last. He snatched a heavy leather satchel containing the ledger and the blood-stained badge from the table, shoving it deep into his canvas coat. He grabbed his remaining Colt revolver, fired 3 rapid shots through the shattered doorway to keep the bounty hunters' heads buried in the snow, and threw himself toward the cellar. He dropped through the trap door just as a massive burning support beam crashed down onto his rocking chair, obliterating it in a shower of sparks. He reached up, grabbed the heavy iron ring on the underside of the door, and hauled the wooden hatch shut.
The transition from the roaring, blazing inferno of the cabin to the absolute suffocating darkness of the root cellar was jarring. The air down here was frigid, smelling strongly of damp earth-pulverized stone and the sharp metallic tang of fear. Are you hurt? Nathaniel asked, his voice echoing unnaturally in the confined space. He struck a sulfur match against the sole of his boot.
The tiny yellow flame flared to life, casting long, trembling shadows across the earthen walls. Gwen was holding Taba tightly against her chest, rocking the child. Datest stood nearby her chest, heaving the thin cut on her cheek, bleeding freely. "We are alive," Gwen whispered. "For now," Nathaniel replied grimly. He held the match high and moved toward the back wall of the cellar. He had dug this space out entirely by hand 15 years ago, but he hadn't stopped at creating a pantry. He moved a stack of heavy wooden crates filled with preserved peaches, revealing a jagged, narrow fissure in the solid granite of the mountain. "An old silver prospector's aid to eat," Nathaniel explained, his breath pluming in the dim light. "I hollowed it out to tap a cold spring, but the vein runs straight through the ridge. It comes out 300 yards up the pass, right beneath a rock formation called the Devil's Tooth. Will they know?" Datest asked, her eyes darting upward to the ceiling. The floorboards above them were groaning under the intense heat of the fire. "Jessup is a bloodhound," Nathaniel said, pushing the girls toward the narrow opening. "Once the cabin burns down to the stone foundation, he'll sift the ashes. He'll find the iron hinges of this door. We need to be a mile high by the time he does. Move." They plunged into the tunnel. The darkness was absolute the moment Nathaniel's match burned out. They had to navigate entirely by touch, running their hands along the freezing, jagged granite walls. The air grew thinner and colder with every step. For an eternity, the only sound was the scraping of their boots on the loose scree and the ragged, desperate sound of their own breathing. The wind hit them before the light did. A low, mournful howl echoed down the tunnel, carrying the bitter, biting sting of the high-altitude freeze. When they finally rounded the last bend of the rock face, they stumbled out into the blinding, crystalline glare of the Wyoming morning. They stood on a sheer, treacherous, rocky precipice overlooking the valley. Below them, a thick, greasy plume of black smoke spiraled violently into the pristine blue sky, the funeral pyre of the only home Nathaniel Reed had known for 2 decades.
There was no time to mourn. There was only the mountain and the desperate need to survive it.
"Up!" Nathaniel pointed a gloved finger toward a massive, jagged overhang of rock jutting out from the cliff face nearly 1,000 yards above them. "The Devil's Tooth. We get above the tree line, we force them into the open." The climb was an agonizing descent into sheer physical torment. The snow up here was untouched, a treacherous, shifting ocean of white powder that came up to Nathaniel's waist. Every step required him to lift his heavy boot, drive his knee into the snowbank, crush the powder down, and drag his weight forward. It was exhausting, lung-burning work. He took the lead, acting as a human snowplow, using his massive frame to carve a narrow trench for the women to follow. Gwen followed close behind her face, set in a mask of stoic endurance, dragging little Taba by the hand. Datesta brought up the rear, her obsidian eyes constantly scanning the ridge below them, searching for any movement against the blinding white. For 2 hours they climbed. The altitude thinned the oxygen until every breath felt like inhaling shattered glass. The cold seeped through their wet clothes, gnawing at their bones. Taba had stopped crying. She was simply stumbling forward, driven by the sheer terror of stopping. They found the tunnel? Detes suddenly screamed, her voice cracking the frozen silence. Nathaniel whipped around. 300 yards below them, struggling through the exact deep trench Nathaniel had just carved, were Harrison and Jessup. The tracker was leading the way, his face wrapped in a bloody soot-stained scarf, a rifle resting across his forearm. Harrison was right behind him, his wolfskin coat making him look like a predatory beast crawling up the white slope. They had survived the fire, and their manic, obsessive rage was driving them up the mountain at a terrifying pace.
Keep moving, Nathaniel ordered, his voice ragged. Gwen, take the girls up toward the overhang. Do not stop until you are under the stone. So?
I will fight with you, Datst argued, her hands balling into fists, furious that she had no weapon. You will protect the ledger? Nathaniel barked, his eyes flashing, with an authority that left absolutely no room for debate. If we both die here, Thomas Mitchell's death means nothing. Caldwell wins. Now go. Reluctantly, furiously, Detes nodded. She grabbed her mother's arm and helped her drag Taba up the steepest part of the incline toward the massive jutting overhang of snow-covered granite. Nathaniel turned back to face the slope. He waded through the deep powder, wedging his body behind a frozen, lightning-struck stump. He drew his heavy Colt revolver, resting the long barrel across the rotting wood. He checked the cylinder. 5 rounds. 5 rounds against 2 men armed with repeating rifles. Crack. Jessup fired on the move. The bullet skipped off the granite rock face just inches from Nathaniel's head, showering him with sharp stone fragments that bit into his cheek. Nathaniel ducked back, the sound of the gunshot echoing endlessly across the canyon walls.
Crack. A second shot tore through the air. This time there was no sound of stone shattering. Instead, a hot, blinding, searing pain exploded through Nathaniel's left thigh.
He grunted a deep, guttural sound of agony as his leg buckled beneath him. He collapsed into the snowbank. The pristine white powder around his leg instantly bloomed with a horrifying bright crimson stain. Nathaniel lay on his back in the freezing powder, his teeth gritted so hard his jaw ached. He didn't panic. He reached down with trembling, blood-slicked fingers, unbuckled his heavy leather gun belt, and dragged it down his leg. He wrapped it tightly around his upper thigh, just above the bullet hole, yanking the leather strap brutally tight to stem the arterial bleeding.
He was pinned down, he was bleeding out, and he was outgunned. You're done, Reed. Harrison's voice carried up the ridge, dripping with malicious, cruel triumph. He was close now, less than 100 yards. I'm going to take my time with you, old man. Then I'm going up there and skinning those squaws alive. Balked.
Nathaniel forced himself to roll over, pressing his chest against the frozen stump. He looked down the mountain. Harrison and Jessup were advancing slowly, confidently, laughing as they saw the massive smear of blood Nathaniel had left in the snow. Then Nathaniel looked up. Directly above Harrison and Jessup, hanging precariously over the sheer cliff face, was the Devil's Tooth. It was a massive, unstable cornice of snow, thousands of tons of packed ice and powder that the blizzard had pushed over the edge of the mountain. It hung there, defying gravity, loaded to its absolute breaking point. Nathaniel Reed had not survived 20 years in the high timber by relying solely on his guns. He knew the mountain. He knew its temperament, its physics, and its unforgiving wrath. He reached deep into the pocket of his heavy wool coat. His fingers brushed past the blood-stained silver badge and closed around a small canvas-wrapped cylinder. It was a half-pound charge of blasting powder he used for clearing stubborn stumps, complete with a painfully short 3-second fuse. Harrison, Nathaniel yelled, his voice echoing off the canyon. You want the ledger? Come and get it? Harrison laughed a brutal, ugly sound. He raised his Winchester, preparing to put a bullet through Nathaniel's skull the moment the old man showed his face. Nathaniel struck a lucifer match against the frozen bark of the stump. His hands were shaking violently from the blood loss and the cold, but the match flared to life. He touched it to the short fuse. It hissed violently, sputtering a trail of angry, brilliant yellow sparks. He didn't throw it down at the men.
With a primal roar that tore his throat, summoning every ounce of remaining strength in his battered body, Nathaniel hurled the explosive charge straight up into the air, aiming directly for the massive overhang of snow above the bounty hunters.
Jessup stopped laughing. He lowered his rifle, looking up at the small black object, arcing gracefully against the bright blue sky. What in hell?
The explosion was deafening.
It was a sharp, concussive crack that hit the eardrums like a physical blow. For a single suspended heartbeat, there was absolute, terrifying silence. The world seemed to hold its breath.
Then the mountain groaned.
A deep, terrifying rumble vibrated through the bedrock, a sound so profound it vibrated in Nathaniel's chest. The massive snow cornice detached entirely from the cliff face. It began as a cascade, a graceful waterfall of white. But within 2 seconds, it transformed into an apocalyptic roaring tidal wave of blinding white wrath. Millions of tons of snow ice and sheared rock swept down the sheer face of the Devil's Tooth. It hit the tree line with the force of a runaway locomotive, snapping ancient 100-foot pine trees like dry twigs. The sound was deafening, a continuous roaring thunder that swallowed the sky. Harrison and Jessup didn't even have time to scream. They looked up, their eyes wide with sudden absolute terror, just before the white wave crashed over them. They were instantly buried beneath a suffocating, freezing tomb of absolute darkness, crushed by the weight of a mountain that had finally decided it had seen enough of men's cruelty. The avalanche rushed down into the valley below, leaving a massive scoured scar of bare granite in its wake. Nathaniel lay on his back in the snow, breathing heavily, watching the fine white dust of the avalanche settle in the cold, clear air. The mountain was silent once more.
2 weeks later, the heavy iron-studded oak doors of Fort Washakie swung open.
Captain John G. Burke, a stern but honorable cavalry officer known for his meticulous recording of frontier injustices, sat behind a heavy mahogany desk. He was a man who still believed in the sanctity of the uniform he wore. He looked up in utter shock as 4 battered, frostbitten, and exhausted figures were escorted into his office by the fort's bewildered guards. Nathaniel Reed leaned heavily on a crude wooden crutch he had carved from a sapling. He was a shadow of a man, his face gaunt, his eyes hollowed by pain and exhaustion. Beside him stood Gwen, quiet, regal, and dignified, holding little Taba tightly by the hand. Daydstate stepped forward. Her obsidian eyes were as sharp and uncompromising as the day she had arrived at the burning cabin. Without a single word, she reached into her battered leather satchel. She placed the tarnished, blood-stained silver badge directly onto Captain Burke's desk. Then she laid the heavy leather-bound ledger beside it. Burke picked up the badge. He recognized the federal stamp immediately. His eyes widened. He slowly opened the ledger, his fingers tracing the handwritten columns detailing Amos Caldwell's massive embezzlement, the stolen beef rations, the bribery of territorial judges, and the calculated starvation of the tribes. As Burke read, his expression hardened from shock into cold military fury. "Where did you get this?" Burke asked quietly, looking up at the scarred mountain man and the 3 Apache women. "A dead man?" "Yes." Nathaniel grunted, shifting his weight painfully on the crutch. "And it cost me my home, my peace, and nearly my life to bring it down off the mountain to you. Do your job, Captain." Burke stood up, his hand resting instinctively on the brass hilt of his cavalry saber. He looked at the women, his eyes softening with a profound, solemn respect. "I will wire the federal marshals in Cheyenne immediately," Burke said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "Amos Caldwell's reign is over. He will hang for this, and his empire will be dismantled piece by piece. You have done a great service to your people and to the law." Burke stepped around the desk. "You will be granted safe harbor here at the fort. No one will touch you. You are under the protection of the United States Army." Gwen turned to look at Nathaniel. For the first time in a month, the crushing weight of survival seemed to lift from her shoulders. She reached out her gentle, weathered hand, resting lightly against Nathaniel's heavy canvas coat, right over his heart. She did not speak. She didn't need to. The slow, exhausted smile that touched her lips conveyed a depth of gratitude that English words could never capture. They were safe. The ledger brought Amos Caldwell's complete and total ruin. Within a week, federal marshals descended upon the Bighorn Basin, seizing his properties, arresting his corrupt deputies, and dragging the cattle baron away in chains. Gwen Datest and Taba found safe sanctuary at Fort Washakie, protected by the very government Caldwell had tried to subvert. As for Nathaniel Reed, he did not stay for the medals or the accolades. He refused the military doctor's offer to properly set his leg in a hospital bed. Before the spring thaw truly set in while the high passes were still choked with ice, Nathaniel slipped quietly out of the fort's gates in the dead of night. He never rebuilt his ruined cabin. He faded back into the high timber, retreating to an altitude where the air was thin and the silence was absolute, becoming a phantom of the Bighorn Basin once more. But the mountain winds still whisper the legend of the old scarred trapper. They carry the story of a broken warrior who traded his absolute solitude for the salvation of three strangers, proving to the harsh, unforgiving frontier that even in the deepest, deadliest winter, mercy could not be frozen over.